Hi, my name is Liz Hebbard. I'm Assistant Professor of French and Francophone Studies at Indiana University, and I'm here today to talk to Clare Norburn. Clare, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, I'm Clare Norburn. I am a soprano and also a playwright of these strange things called concert plays, kind of half a drama, half a concert. And I also run the medieval group, The Telling, who have created this piece, Unsung Heroine, that you're going to be seeing.
Yeah, so we're here to talk about this amazing recording of the concert play Unsung Heroine, the imagined life and love of troubadour Countess Beatriz de Día. So if it's okay with you, Clare, we'll just dive in with some questions.
Yeah, sure, fire away.
Okay. So your project in this film brings together the known, so one troubadour's melody that survives, and there I'm using the word troubadours, which is the Occitan word for female poet-composer in Occitan. But the project also has to account for a multitude of unknowns. For example, we know nothing certain about Beatriz's life. So with the creative license to fill in those gaps in this project, why imagine such a tragic version of her life?
Well, I think, and I'm kind of, I write a lot of these concert plays, and although my heart is medieval music, I've written also concert plays about Purcell and Beethoven, where you have reams of information, stuff to cut out. It's more to cut out rather than what to put in. Of course, I have the opposite problem here, in that, as you say, we know nothing about her really. We don't even know entirely that she kind of even really existed, or if she did, quite who she might have been. There are some thoughts about who she might have been, and the big clue that we have towards her, but it is only a clue, is obviously the Vidas. So this is the kind of series of biographies of the troubadours, and her Vidas is very, very short. It basically says that she was that she was the wife of Guillaume de Poitiers, and also the lover of Rimbaud de Renga. And that is, and we, who those people are, there's a great debate about. But the second of those, Rimbaud de Renga, is thought to be the troubadour Rimbaud de Renga, and that is the assumption that I have made in writing Unsung Heroine. So, so we're really talking about, that's all I have. That's the starting point. But what I do have, of course, is wider knowledge about the troubadour tradition, about courtly love, and what I really wanted to do in writing this piece was to sort of unpack some of those ideas, which are kind of quite foreign and quite codified for a modern audience, and present them in a way that wasn't terribly academic, but more kind of creative, so that actually you didn't need to be academic, you didn't need to know anything about medieval music, you certainly didn't need to know anything about the troubadours, but you could just come along and try and experience what Beatriz as a woman troubadour, what her experience might have been. So why I imagine such a sad existence for her is both grounded in the experience of other women. Women were married off early on in life, so I've kind of imagined she's married around the age of 12, 13, and that was quite a common experience. I've imagined, and of course, aristocratic women in particular had no choice about who they married. So there was this and that creates a very strange kind of context for the idea of love. You've got enforced marriages, and you've got this very idealized idea of love, which is, almost certainly where the whole idea of a love triangle comes in, which is so pervasive in not just in the troubadour tradition, but also all the great romances, particularly the stunning example of Tristan and Isolde, and King Mark, that we all know. is almost certainly grounded in that experience. So there was that, but there was also the idea, which is kind of inherent in the troubadour literature, and particularly in the vidas and the razos, the stories that are often told to introduce the sort of backstory of the song. Often the songs and the lives of the troubadours are very much presented as if their artistic output comes from a place of experience. And so, but all those reasons kind of put together, that was kind of the research element of where I started in creating and imagining a sort of life and a kind of emotional life for Beatriz.
I think it's beautifully done. I think Anna Dimitriou does a fantastic job in really embodying both Beatriz's emotions and those of the other characters she interacts with. And I think something that your creative interpretation does of Beatriz's fictional life, it must necessarily be fictional because, as you say, we know nothing for certain about who she was, is that it really dives deep into every emotion in the songs that you perform. And I think as someone who teaches medieval literature, who teaches troubadour song, something that your concert play does really well is create empathy with these mysterious, sometimes forgotten or just unknown figures from the past.
So I'm really pleased you say that, because that's really the intention behind, writing it. And this is the first piece that I've now written. I've lost count of how many I've now written, but this was the very first piece that I wrote in 2010. And I didn't really know what I was doing. As you see it on the film, it's been adapted and shortened a great deal because I learned the hard way that less is more. But that's exactly what I wanted to do. Was I kind of wanted to take Achantar as a starting point, and that song is so packed with feeling and hurt. Really, she's in such a hurt place, and try and imagine what kind of led up to that. And so taking the sort of the snippet of a starting point of Rainbow de Renga and that song together, then obviously what you're left with is a betrayal. And so that's kind of how it was all put together. And so really the whole idea of the piece is, why did she write that song? Where did those feelings come from? And I try and answer that question, or imagine the answer to that question in what I've written.
It's so beautifully human. I say, as someone who loves this lyric tradition and teaches it and studies it, there's sort of scholarship that goes back and forth, or let's say must account on the one hand for whatever the historical existence of these figures must have been. And in many cases, like that of Beatriz, we simply don't know. And a sort of idea that because this tradition is so codified, as you say, there are so many common places that you find in every lyric, that sort of leads us to a sort of superficial understanding of whatever emotions are expressed in song. And I think that superficial idea is more accessible than recovering real hurt, real heartache, real love in these mysterious figures. But I wonder, so you've explained very well why you've chosen the version that you did, but I wonder if you have any other ideas about who Beatriz could have been, what she could have felt that you didn't get to explore, especially knowing that now this is a shortened version of the original concert play. Are there other elements in the longer version, or are there other ideas that didn't make it even into the longer version that you have about her?
Yeah, I mean, the longer version had just little bits of extra information. So for example, in the longer story, there was a sort of backstory about, or references to Guillaume, her husband's family, because, of course, what would happen is you would go and, have to live with the in-laws. You know, of course, that creates a whole hierarchy of potential difficulties that I imagined. And it also in the troubadour tradition, there is a sort of often an idea of the lasangers, as they're called, the gossips, the people who are kind of backstabbing, who are trying to stop the relationship between the lover and the lady. And so that's something that kind of got cut, but I thought was such an interesting idea because it makes her even more isolated. You know, I think that's the really key thing about, you know, she, in a way, it's kind of inevitable that she's going to fall for Rimbaud because she's starved of intellectual stimulus, and then he's there. And so, you know, the falling in love is falling in love with literature and falling in love with someone with whom she can share that experience, as much as falling in love with someone because she's not had that kind of experience with her husband. So it's particularly powerful, I think. That was, so I think it was things like that that kind of added more to the backstory that perhaps required too much explanation. And also we kind of just had to cut to the chase a bit more. I mean, I think what I mean is, I suppose I've learned, in fact, very early on, someone gave me some very wise advice that, you know, you've got to make a decision about, are you going to be didactic or are you going to be dramatic? And you kind of can't be both, although you can be dramatic, grounded in having done the research and having done the thinking about it. And I made the decision I wanted to be dramatic, partly because, you know, in the early music world, we're also grounded in academia, and I felt that the thing that I'm really passionate about is trying to communicate the music to a much wider audience who perhaps don't come from that place, or if they do come from that place, perhaps they don't know anything very much about music or about the medieval world. So I just wanted to make a story that was kind of almost informing them of the facts, you know, without them really noticing it, I suppose. A bit like I often think about the film Shakespeare in Love, which you can watch on so many different levels. I mean, you can just watch it and not know anything about Shakespeare or about revenge tragedy or anything. But then there are all sorts of lovely little snippets in there that are kind of in jokes. I mean, John Webster as a little boy telling the tale of a rat and things like, you know. So if you don't know who John Webster is, you're not going to get that reference. But if you do, it gives you something. I think that's so clever. And I've done the same sort of thing in ways that probably only pleases me. So, for example, in the song by La Duchesse de Lorraine, from the troubadour tradition, Un petit d'avant le jour, there's a reference to the husband as having a red tickly beard. And so I've given Guillaume a red tickly beard. I mean, so like no one will ever know that that's where it came from, but there are kind of little authentic moments in there that I kind of know where they come from. And maybe somehow that's kind of spills in, that kind of little detail spills into some kind of authenticity in the piece, I hope. I don't know.
I definitely think there are many literary inspirations, and the sort of even the love triangle, as you mentioned Tristan and Isolde, but there are many other examples of courtly literature that explore the tension between a sort of duty to marriage and to the social institution that it represents, especially for the nobility, and the love duty that one feels to one's own emotions. And I think by eliminating the obstacle of the naysayers, it brings our focus much more closely to Beatriz, to her interior life. So the naysayers are kind of this exterior obstacle, but she's really, and Rimbaud's marriage is obviously an exterior obstacle, but it brings us more closely into her feelings. And I think what you do in that way is very true to the literary tradition. In some ways, the concert play is also like an extended razzo, which is a piece to explore the inspiration behind any given song. Those also might be to some extent, or even entirely fictional, but it's a dramatic introduction to a piece you're about to hear or read. And I think the other thing that the film does beautifully is kind of show the relationship between love and poetry. In the troubadour tradition, good love makes good poetry, and good poetry inspires good love.
Yeah, exactly.
Reciprocity is very clear in the figure of Beatriz and her relationship to Rimbaud.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's also why I kind of put that scene in with Pere, the family troubadour, who kind of, you know, I really enjoyed writing that scene. And this annoying 9-year-old, and yet, you know, and he is, you know, he tells him that, you know, he tells her that message that you can't really be a troubadour, a proper troubadour, until you experience those feelings. Those feelings have to come from somewhere. And I think that also goes back to the song and those feelings having such a real, you know, you can't, whoever Beatriz was or whoever wrote that song, you can't believe that that person didn't experience those emotions. Mm-hmm. They clearly understood what it felt like. The little touches about, you know, that you're generous to everybody else and you're not to me, you know, that feeling that we all know when we're in love with someone and that they don't reciprocate. You know, that comes from a real place. You can't kind of explore that purely through reading other or hearing other, in their cases, hearing other songs.
I think it's just so powerful to spin that out into a way that is approachable to those who are unfamiliar with this tradition. But even in the name Pere, you've sought, let's say, common names that were in use in that area at that time, and I think those are kind of beautiful little clues to dig out as someone is inspired to learn more about the troubadours by seeing Unsung Heroine. Then those are the kinds of things that they'll discover, these little hidden treasures in the way that you've crafted the piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also how she's inspired by hearing,
yes,
you know, by other troubadours' works. I think that's almost certainly, you know, that they would have heard and kind of taken inspiration from each other's works. I mean, I think that's really clear.
Yeah, it is an artistic endeavor, but also a sort of very social one. So responding to previous generations and current generations of artists in your own work. I think, yeah, that's very true to the experience of someone like Beatriz or whoever she was or might have been.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, whoever created that song knew that tradition and knew the song, you know, other songs by other people, and kind of and created that song. It's so hard. I always find myself, I'm using the word created here because writing, you know, it's so easy to say write with a modern head on, but of course they didn't write it down. They, you know, created it as singer-songwriters do today in their bedrooms. You know, I think that's also such an interesting, you know, and it's so easy to forget when we're looking at manuscripts and at sources, and we're with our modern heads on, sort of so taken up with music being written down.
Absolutely, and if we can dive into the sources a little bit, which is my area of specialty, my favorite thing to talk about. So I mentioned at the very beginning of our chat that this melody for, I don't think I said the specific song, but the final piece in the concert play, which is A Chantar, is attributed to Beatriz in several sources through its text, but it's the only melody that survives in any of the sources that is attributed to a woman composer. But in general, the songs survive piecemeal, about 90% without any melody, and many with texts or melodies incomplete or in various versions across the sources. as we can all imagine, historical performance or the performance of early music always involves a lot of historically informed, but ultimately creative speculation. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your program, the choice of songs, and especially your choice to set a text whose tune has been lost to an existing melody. This is, again, something that the troubadours did all of the time, borrow a melody and compose a new text for it. But I would just love to hear how you constructed the program in the concert play.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So both the troubadour and for one troubadour and one trouvère piece, we did a contrafactus. So we had only a poem, but we didn't have the music. So one of them is by Beatriz, and the other is by the Duchesse de Lorraine, the one that I just mentioned with the red tickly beard. In the case of Beatriz, I kind of looked around for what you do is you try and find a song with the same meter that kind of fits. So the same number of lines and the same meter in each line. There weren't that many possibilities, and also I kind of knew that the Jordi Sabal recording had chosen that the melody that we finally chose. And I actually feel what I feel about that melody that I chose. So this is actually the second piece. It's called Esta I in Greu Quisirik, and it's the second piece in the concert play as you see it. And it's about the words are about a woman who is kind of, she's in turmoil because she hasn't granted her love, presumably means slept with her knight, and she kind of thinks that perhaps she should have done, perhaps she shouldn't have done. She's really torn between the two. And what I love about the melody is that it oscillates up and down. The first half is quite low, and then suddenly in the second half it goes stratospheric, up an octave, almost pretty much, which, you know, for a troubadour repertoire is very unusual. But also the verse ends incomplete. You have to resolve to go back to the first note onto the next verse, kind of resolves it, which I think kind of also mirrors the kind of back and forthness of the words. So that's kind of why I think it's a really good solution for that song. The other one, the Duchesse de Lorraine, I have a very wonderful friend called Leah Stuttart, who went to Basel and studied. She's an absolute expert, not just on medieval music, but particularly on medieval music, and not so much on the troubadour and trouvère tradition. But she, when I was trying to perform this piece, and we were saying, how on earth can you perform this piece? Because what's tricky about it is the final lines change, and you have extra lines in certain of the verses. So it's really hard to find something that fits. So she did a kind of recomposition using a variety of different sources so that the ends of the lines are different. And if you listen to that song, that is a really hard song to sing, because you have to remember where you are and which version you're going into, because it changes each time. So that is kind of the process of putting it together. But in terms of how we chose, I mean, that's when you're performing medieval music, and particularly this because it's all single line melody that you're talking about from the troubadour and trouvère traditions, and obviously for a lot of medieval repertoire, you have to make some decisions about how you perform it too. So I wanted in Unsung Heroine to have a kind of quite a big range of ways of performing it. So the Belle de Ventisol song, which is probably one of the most famous troubadour songs of all time, Convela Lausetta, such beautiful, beautiful words and such a beautiful melody. And that
one of the most commonly contrafacted melodies, actually.
Yeah, but also exists in so many sources, doesn't it? That it exists in the three main troubadour sources, but also it's quite cited in other sources. So it just shows how popular that song is. So the likelihood is that Beatriz would have known it, and so I felt that was kind of an obvious piece to include, but also the way that we do it is it's just me singing it single line melody. And there is an argument, and a lot of historians think that's possibly how it was performed. There are some arguments that you might have had accompaniment from harp or from vielle, which is why we have harp and vielle, because they are referred to in the repertoire, and but what they played. So what we do is, Joy Smith and Giles Lewin, who plays medieval harp and vielle respectively, they kind of shadow often the melody. They play drones, they improvise in the mode or around the melody, in between phrases, and particularly in between the verses. I mean, that's what and so actually it's quite hard to get used to that. If you're not used to performing with music, it's different every time, so what you do in the rehearsal is not necessarily what comes out in the performance. And you kind of sometimes, that takes a lot of getting used to. When I started doing it, you'd start to sing, and then suddenly perhaps they'd come in with an accompanying thing and go, oh, okay, I don't know if I'm going to start now. And you just don't know when you're going to come in. You don't know, you just have to kind of respond to what happens in the moment. So it's very not improvised. Well, they're improvising, but also as a singer, you are responding to their improvisation, which could, in an infinitesimal moment, change. And you kind of have to be on your toes a bit, really. So that's kind of why, and instrumentally, we've chosen some of the, we've done a mixture of things. We've chosen some trouvère songs that we did as instrumental, but we also chose some estampes, French dances that are kind of the period, and there isn't kind of an obvious tradition, and the troubadour songs particularly are, with the exception of Calendar Maya, which I can talk about in a minute, are not really rhythmicized, so they're not kind of so good for instrumentals. So that's kind of the decision making that we make. Calendar Maya is an interesting exception. It's a song, so we have kind of created a rhythm to it. And often people do, and the reason being that it's a kind of estampes in its own right. That again comes from both the structure and the piece, and the very kind of short repeated lines, but also it's in the text. This is my estampes. So that's kind of different, but that's absolutely the exception. Generally, I think you can't impose. There were editions, if you look at editions made in the sort of 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, where people have imposed the rhythm, but I don't think they work, because it's meant to be declaimed, I'm sure.
Right, so, and that is a long-standing debate in the scholarship, is whether there was a fixed rhythm or not, and whether that's represented in the sources. Generally speaking, it's not. And another sort of piece of the puzzle that you have to fill in yourself as a performer of this early music. Sort of especially, you have freedom because it's only a single voice performing the song, right? You're not trying to match up with the second singer who's singing another melody. You have this great freedom, which, as you say, might in the moment give you a chance to interpret things differently every time you perform it.
Exactly, but of course the narrative is really important.
Exactly.
In a way, I mean, that's actually true. That's why I love medieval music. Is the narrative is it's all about the narrative. It's all about storytelling, which is why we call the telling. That's where it comes from, and that's the starting point. The music is kind of a vehicle for telling a story, I think, for a lot of medieval music, and also for this tradition, I feel.
It's lovely, and I think what I want your audience to understand is how much work you've done to create this story, on the level of the melodies themselves, on the level of Beatriz's life, and putting together this program. So I think if I have one final, if I can ask one final question, it is, what do you want viewers to come away with? What do you want them to take with them after seeing this film?
I want them to kind of be, I suppose, imbued with the spirit of the song, you know, of Attentat, but also to be kind of fascinated to go away and listen to more troubadour and troubadour, but I mean, obviously we're talking about the troubadour tradition primarily. Sorry, the reason I should have said that we included troubadours is because of that being able to have some rhythmic pieces, have some variety. I felt that was really important. I should have said that. And so there isn't, you know, they're two different traditions, but they're kind of time-wise are running at the same time. So and
we think of them as different traditions because they're in different languages. So the troubadour,
in different languages and divided country, really, language-wise.
But there are troubadour songs that survive with troubadour collections and vice versa. So I think it's also historically accurate that they would be familiar to the same audiences. It's
true. And one of the troubadour traditions, you'll know better than me, but one of the troubadour editions is kind of bowdlerized in Old French, isn't it? So the language source for that is not such a good source, but it's interesting musically. And that shows the cross-fertilization and the knowledge between the two traditions. Yeah, but I mean, in terms of what people take away, I think, I'd really, I just wanted to produce a way into this music because I love it so much, and in the UK particularly, no one really does it. There's only a couple of groups who do this repertoire. It's kind of like it's not sexy like the cantigas, for example, which everybody does who does medieval music. And I think it's because it is quite hard to get into and to understand the context of. So that's really what I wanted people to come away with, was to be kind of fascinated and to be given some insight into why they were creating songs and why and the sense that these are the first love songs, really, you know, and they have a long and important tradition, so they shouldn't be forgotten. They're important both poetically and musically.
That's lovely. Well, thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been wonderful to chat. I have many more questions, but I don't want to keep your viewers from exploring the concert play themselves. So let's now introduce the film. The Bloomington Early Music Festival presents The Telling's newest production, Unsung Heroine, The Imagined Life and Love of Beatriz de Día, an original concert play by the inimitable Clare Norburn. Enjoy. Thanks so much, Claire.
Pleasure. Thank you for great questions.